Putin holds firm Ukraine territory non-negotiable. Let me take you back to February 21st of this year, not the anniversary of the war's beginning, but the day Vladimir Putin stood before Russia's Federal Assembly and delivered a speech that should have sent shockwaves through Western capitals. The media, as usual, fixated on the nuclear saber rattling, the suspension of New START, the usual Kremlin posturing. But they missed the one line that mattered most. When Putin declared that Russia's territorial gains in Ukraine were non-negotiable, he wasn't just making a rhetorical play, he was drawing a red line in the sand, and not the kind that can be erased with another round of sanctions or a fresh batch of HIMARS. I've spent decades studying this part of the world, first as a soldier, then as a strategist, and now as someone who watches these developments with a mix of frustration and dread. What we're witnessing isn't just another chapter in the Ukraine war. It's the culmination of a geopolitical struggle that has been building for years, one that the West has consistently misread, misframed, and mismanaged. And if we don't start seeing this conflict for what it really is, a proxy war with existential stakes for the global order, we're going to wake up one day to a reality we're not prepared to face. So let's start with the story they're telling you. The official narrative is simple, almost comforting in its clarity. Russia, the aggressor, launched an unprovoked invasion of Ukraine in 2022, violating international law and threatening the rules-based order. The West, led by the United States, has rallied to Ukraine's defense, providing military aid, economic support, and unwavering moral solidarity. The goal? To help Ukraine reclaim all its territory, including Crimea and the Donbass, and force Russia to the negotiating table on terms favorable to Kyiv. The war, we're told, is a struggle between democracy and autocracy, between the forces of light and darkness. And if we just stay the course, more weapons, more sanctions, more pressure, victory is inevitable. The data seems to support this. The U.S. has committed over $113 billion in aid to Ukraine since the war began, with billions more in the pipeline. NATO has exited its presence in Eastern Europe, reinforcing Poland, the Baltics, and Romania. The EU has imposed 12 rounds of sanctions on Russia, targeting everything from energy exports to oligarchs' yachts. And on the battlefield, Ukraine has shown remarkable resilience, retaking Kherson and Kharkiv in 2022, and holding the line against Russian offensives in Bakhmut and Avdiivka. The message from Washington, Brussels, and Kyiv is Russia is losing. The war is unwinnable for Putin. And if we just double down, the Kremlin will have no choice but to sue for peace. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not just incomplete, it's dangerously misleading. Let me tell you what they're not telling you. First, the idea that Russia is losing is a fantasy. Yes, Ukraine has fought bravely, and yes, Russia has suffered staggering casualties. Estimates range from 120,000 to 300,000 dead and wounded. But here's the thing about wars: they favor the side with the deeper bench. Russia has a population of 143 million, a defense industry that's been on a war footing for 2 years, and a leadership that has shown zero willingness to back down, no matter the cost. Ukraine, by contrast, has a population of 36 million, a shrinking pool of manpower, and an economy that's been hollowed out by the war. The recent mobilization law in Kyiv, which lowers the conscription age and extends service terms, is a tacit admission that Ukraine is running out of men. And let's not Russia controls roughly 18% of Ukraine's territory, including some of its most economically vital regions. That's not a position of weakness. That's a position of leverage. Second, the notion that Russia will negotiate away its territorial gains is a delusion. Putin's speech in February wasn't just bluster. It was a statement of intent. The Kremlin has already annexed 4 Ukrainian regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, and declared them part of Russia in perpetuity. That's not just a legal fiction. It's a strategic reality. For Putin, these territories are now Russian soil, and any attempt to retake them is an attack on Russia itself. That's why he's framed this war as an existential struggle, not just for Ukraine, but for the survival of Russia as a great power. And if you think he's going to back down after sacrificing hundreds of thousands of lives and billions of rubles, you don't understand the man or the system he's built. Third, the West's strategy is based on a fundamental misreading of Russian resolve. We keep hearing that sanctions will cripple Russia's economy, that military aid will turn the tide, that Putin's regime is fragile. But here's the Russia's economy didn't collapse in 2022. It contracted by just 2.1%, and this year, the IMF expects it to grow by 2.6%. That's not the performance of a country on the brink. Meanwhile, Russia's defense industry is producing artillery shells at a rate of 2.5 million per year, more than the US and Europe combined. And as for Putin's grip on power? The man just won another 6-year term with 87% of the vote. You don't need to like it, but you do need to understand Putin isn't going anywhere. And neither is Russia's commitment to this war. So what's really happening here? Let's pull back the curtain. This isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the global order. For the past 3 decades, the United States has operated under the assumption that it can shape the world in its image, that democracy, free markets, and American military power can be exported to every corner of the globe. That's what we call liberal hegemony, and it's been the guiding principle of U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. But there's a problem with this: it assumes that other great powers will accept American dominance indefinitely. And they won't. Russia, China, and a growing number of non-aligned states see the world differently. They see a multipolar system, where no single power calls the shots. They see spheres of influence, where great powers have veto rights over security arrangements in their neighborhoods. And they see the US as a declining hegemon, overextended, overstretched, and desperate to maintain its primacy. That's why Russia invaded Ukraine, not just to reclaim lost territory, but to challenge the post-Cold War order. And that's why China is watching this war so closely. Because if Russia succeeds in carving out a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, it sets a precedent for Beijing in the South China Sea, in Taiwan, and beyond. Now, let me be: I'm not defending Putin's actions. What Russia has done in Ukraine is brutal, illegal, and morally indefensible. But realpolitik isn't about morality. It's about power. And the hard truth is that the US and its allies have backed Russia into a corner. By extending NATO to Russia's borders, by supporting regime change in Ukraine in 2014, by arming and training Ukrainian forces for years, we created a security dilemma that left Putin with 2: accept strategic encirclement or lash out. He chose the latter. And now we're stuck in a war that neither side can win, but neither side can afford to lose. Let's talk about the military realities on the ground, because this is where the rubber meets the road. Right now, Ukraine is running out of men, ammunition, air defense systems, and time. The much-anticipated 2023 counteroffensive failed to achieve its objectives, and Ukraine's forces are now on the defensive, struggling to hold the line against Russian advances in Avdiivka and Kupiansk. The US has sent over 300 tanks, thousands of armored vehicles, and billions in artillery shells, but it's not enough. Russia is outproducing the West in key areas, and its military has adapted to Western tactics. Meanwhile, Ukraine's manpower crisis is becoming acute. Reports suggest that Kyiv is now recruiting convicts and elderly men to fill their ranks, a desperate measure that speaks to the depth of the problem. On the Russian side, the picture is different. Yes, Russia has taken massive losses, but it's also learned from its mistakes. The initial blitzkrieg failed, so they switched to a strategy of attrition, grinding down Ukrainian forces with artillery and drones. They've mobilized over 300,000 reservists, and their defense industry is running at full capacity. Most importantly, they've secured supply lines from North Korea and Iran, ensuring a steady flow of artillery shells and drones. And let's not Russia has the advantage of interior lines. They can shift forces quickly along their own rail networks, while Ukraine is dependent on Western logistics that are slow, bureaucratic, and vulnerable to disruption. The biggest wild card? Escalation. The US and NATO are walking a tightrope. They want to support Ukraine, but they don't want to provoke a direct conflict with Russia. That's why we haven't seen F-16s in Ukrainian skies, why we haven't given Ukraine ATACMS with the range to strike deep into Russia, and why we've drawn the line at sending troops. But here's the longer this war drags on, the greater the risk of miscalculation. A stray missile hitting NATO territory, a Ukrainian strike on a Russian nuclear command center, a cyber attack that spirals out of control, any of these could trigger a wider war. And let's be: the US military is not prepared for a direct conflict with Russia. Our forces are stretched thin, our munition stockpiles are depleted, and our industrial base is struggling to keep up with demand. The hawks in Washington who think this war can be won with more weapons and more resolve are living in a fantasy world. The last 20 years of war in the Middle East should have taught us that military power alone can't solve political problems. Now, let's talk about the domestic politics, because this is where things get really messy. In the US, the war in Ukraine has become a political football. The Biden administration has framed it as a struggle for democracy, a chance to weaken Russia and reassert American leadership. But the reality is more complicated. Support for Ukraine is waning among Republicans, who see it as a distraction from domestic priorities like immigration and the economy. The recent funding bill for Ukraine barely passed the House, and it's clear that the political will to continue this war indefinitely is eroding. Meanwhile, in Europe, the mood is shifting. Hungary has blocked EU aid packages, Slovakia has elected a pro-Russian government, and even in Germany, there's growing fatigue with the economic costs of the war. But here's the neither side can afford to walk away. For Biden, abandoning Ukraine would be a political disaster. It would hand the Republicans a cudgel to beat him with in the 2024 election, and it would signal to the world that America's word can't be trusted. For Putin, backing down would be an admission of defeat, something he can't afford in a system where weakness is fatal. And for Zelensky, the stakes are existential. If Ukraine loses, he loses. It's that simple. So where does that leave us? Let's run through the scenarios. Scenario: the best case. The war ends in a negotiated settlement, with Ukraine regaining some but not all of its territory. Russia agrees to withdraw from parts of the Donbass and Kherson, but keeps Crimea and the land bridge to it. Ukraine gets security guarantees from NATO, but not full membership. The US and Europe provide reconstruction aid, and Russia is gradually reintegrated into the global economy. This is the land for peace model, and it's the best outcome for everyone. But it requires both sides to compromise, and right now, neither is in the mood. Scenario: the most likely. The war grinds on for another 18 to 24 months, with neither side able to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Ukraine holds the line, but Russia makes incremental gains in the east. The US and Europe continue to provide military aid, but at a reduced level, as domestic support wanes. The global economy suffers from prolonged instability, and the risk of escalation remains high. This is the forever war scenario, and it's the most dangerous, because it increases the chances of a catastrophic miscalculation. Scenario: the worst case. Russia launches a major offensive in 2025, breaking through Ukrainian lines and capturing more territory. Ukraine's manpower and ammunition shortages become critical, and Western aid dries up as political support collapses. Zelensky is forced to negotiate from a position of weakness, and Russia dictates the terms. Ukraine is partitioned, with Russia taking the east and south, and the west becoming a rump state under Western protection. NATO is humiliated, and the global order shifts decisively toward multipolarity. This is the outcome that keeps me up at night. Now, let's out and talk about the bigger picture. The war in Ukraine is a symptom of a larger collapse of the post-Cold War order. For 30 years, the US has acted as the world's policeman, intervening in conflicts, toppling regimes, and promoting democracy. But that era is coming to an end. The world is becoming multipolar, with China, Russia, and other rising powers challenging American dominance. And the US is struggling to adapt. The problem isn't just that we're overextended. It's that our strategy is based on a flawed that we can maintain global hegemony indefinitely. But history tells us that all empires decline. Rome fell. The British Empire fell. And the American Empire will fall too, unless we change course. The question: what do we do about it? First, we need to accept that we can't dictate the outcome in Ukraine. We can support Ukraine, but we can't fight Russia's war for them. We need to push for a negotiated settlement, even if it means uncomfortable compromises. That doesn't mean abandoning Ukraine. It means recognizing that the alternative, a prolonged war with no end in sight, is worse. Second, we need to rebuild our military and our industrial base. The war in Ukraine has exposed the weaknesses in our defense production. We can't fight a major war without a robust industrial base, and right now, we don't have one. That needs to change. Third, we need to rethink our grand strategy. The era of liberal hegemony is over. We need a new approach, one that recognizes the limits of American power and the realities of a multipolar world. That means working with other great powers, not against them. It means accepting spheres of influence, not trying to erase them. And it means focusing on our core interests, not trying to police the world. Finally, we need to have an honest conversation with the American people. The war in Ukraine is not a struggle between good and evil. It's a geopolitical conflict with no easy answers. We need to level with the public about the costs, the risks, and the trade-offs. And we need to stop pretending that there's a military solution to every problem. Let me leave you with this. The war in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the global order. And the choices we make in the coming months will shape that future for decades to come. The question: will we learn from our mistakes, or will we repeat them? I've spent my life studying war, and I can tell you the greatest danger isn't the enemy on the battlefield. It's the hubris in our own capitals. We've been here before. We saw it in Vietnam. We saw it in Iraq. And now we're seeing it again in Ukraine. The time for sober reflection is now. Because if we don't change course, we're going to wake up one day to a world we don't recognize and a war we can't win. Now, what most people don't realize is that this war didn't begin in February 2022. It began in 2014, when we backed a coup in Kyiv that overthrew a democratically elected, Russia-friendly government. The Obama administration, with Victoria Nuland at the helm, openly bragged about spending $5 billion to promote democracy in Ukraine, code for regime change. And when the Russians pushed back in Crimea and Donbass, we called it aggression. But let's be, if China backed a coup in Mexico and started arming it to the teeth, we'd do exactly what Russia did. We'd move to secure our borders. We'd demand guarantees. And we'd be called aggressors too. Here's the uncomfortable: this war is as much about NATO action as it is about Ukrainian sovereignty. In 2008, at the Bucharest summit, NATO declared that Ukraine and Georgia would one day join the alliance. That was a red line for Moscow. And when the West kept pushing, despite repeated warnings from diplomats like William Burns, who, as ambassador to Russia in 2008, wrote a cable titled "Niet means Niet," warning that NATO action into Ukraine would trigger a crisis, we ignored it. We thought we could keep acting without consequences. We were wrong. Let me explain why this matters. The establishment narrative in Washington is that Putin is an irrational imperialist, hell-bent on recreating the Soviet Union. But that's not what the intelligence tells us. In 2021, the CIA assessed that Putin's primary concern was not conquest but security, specifically, preventing Ukraine from becoming a Western military outpost on Russia's border. That's why he demanded written guarantees that Ukraine would never join NATO. And when those guarantees weren't forthcoming, he invaded. Now, I'm not justifying the invasion. It was illegal, brutal, and reckless. But if we're going to prevent the next war, we have to understand the roots of this one. And the roots go back decades, to the broken promises of the 1990s, when we assured Gorbachev that NATO wouldn't extend 1 inch eastward, only to do exactly that. To the 2008 war in Georgia, when Saakashvili, emboldened by US support, launched an attack on South Ossetia, only to be crushed by the Russians. To the 2014 coup, which set the stage for everything that followed. The military implications of this war are just as sobering. We've spent the last 2 years arming Ukraine with everything from javelins to HIMARS, and yet the front lines have barely moved. Why? Because modern warfare isn't about who has the most advanced weapons. It's about who can sustain the fight. And right now, Russia is outproducing the West in artillery shells, drones, and missiles by a factor of 5 to 1. The Pentagon's own reports confirm this. In 2023, Russia produced over 2 million artillery shells. The US and Europe combined? Less than 500,000. That's not a recipe for victory. That's a recipe for stalemate. And let's talk about the human cost. Over 70,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed, according to US intelligence estimates. That's more than the entire active duty US Army. The Russians have lost even more, somewhere between 120,000 and 150,000 dead. And for what? A few kilometers of mud in Bakhmut? A ruined city in Avdiivka? This isn't a war of liberation. It's a war of attrition, and attrition wars favor the side with the deeper reserves. That's Russia. Now, the establishment will tell you that we just need to send more weapons, F-16s, ATACMS, long-range missiles. But here's the every time we escalate, Russia escalates right back. When we sent HIMARS, they started targeting Ukrainian command posts with Iskander missiles. When we sent Patriot systems, they started using hypersonic Kinzhals. When we trained Ukrainian pilots on F-16s, they deployed Su-35s and S-400s to shoot them down. This isn't a one-way street. It's an action-reaction cycle, and we're not winning it. Let me give you an example. In 2023, the Ukrainians launched a much-hyped counteroffensive with 9 Western-trained brigades, equipped with Leopard tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, and mine-clearing equipment. The result? After 6 months of fighting, they advanced less than 20 kilometers in some sectors and lost over 20,000 men in the process. The Russians, meanwhile, adapted. They dug in, laid minefields, and used drones to spot and destroy Ukrainian armor before it could break through. This wasn't a failure of Ukrainian courage. It was a failure of Western strategy. We assumed that technology would overcome terrain in numbers. It didn't. And here's the even if Ukraine somehow pushes Russia back to the 2014 lines, what then? Do we think Putin will just accept defeat? Or will he escalate further, cyber attacks, sabotage, even tactical nuclear strikes? The Russians have already threatened to use nuclear weapons if their territorial integrity is threatened. And while I don't think Putin wants a nuclear war, I also don't think he's bluffing. The man has shown he's willing to take risks. And in a corner, he might take even bigger ones. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a do we double down on a war we can't win, or do we start thinking seriously about how to end it? The first option is what the establishment wants. More weapons, more money, more rhetoric about standing with Ukraine until victory. But victory for whom? For the Ukrainians, who are running out of men. For the Europeans, who are running out of money. For the Americans, who are running out of patience. The second option is harder. It means admitting that we overreached. That we misjudged Russia's resolve. That we ignored the warnings of our own diplomats and intelligence officials. It means accepting that Ukraine will never be a NATO member, not now, not ever. And it means negotiating with Putin, not from a position of strength, but from a position of necessity. Now, I know what your Taiwan isn't Ukraine. It's an island 100 miles off the Chinese coast. If we think we can fight a war with China over Taiwan the way we've fought this one, with sanctions, with proxy forces, with half measures, we're deluding ourselves. China has 1.4 billion people. It has the world's largest navy. It has hypersonic missiles that can sink our carriers. And it has a leader, Xi Jinping, who has made reunification with Taiwan a core national priority. If we can't win a war against Russia, a declining power with a GDP smaller than Italy's, how do we think we're going to win one against China? The answer: we won't. And the longer we pretend otherwise, the closer we get to a conflict we can't afford to lose and can't afford to fight. So what's the way forward? First, we need to stop pretending that this war is about democracy versus autocracy. It's not. It's about geopolitics. And in geopolitics, interests matter more than ideals. Second, we need to accept that Russia isn't going anywhere. It's a nuclear-armed great power with a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. We can contain it, we can deter it, but we can't wish it away. Third, we need to rebuild our military, not for endless wars in the Middle East, but for the real threats of the 21st: China in the Pacific, Russia in Europe, and the rise of a multipolar world. Most importantly, we need to stop outsourcing our foreign policy to think tanks and defense contractors. These are the same people who told us Iraq had WMDs. The same people who told us Afghanistan would be a quick victory. The same people who are now telling us that Ukraine can win with just a little more aid. They're wrong. And the American people are starting to see it. The polls don't lie. Support for Ukraine aid is plummeting. In 2022, 60% of Americans backed sending weapons to Kyiv. Today, that number is below 40%. And among Republicans, it's even lower. Why? Because people are tired of endless wars. They're tired of being told that we have to choose between supporting Ukraine and fixing our own country. And they're right to be tired. The question: will our leaders listen? Or will they keep doubling down on a failed strategy until the bill comes due and it's not just Ukraine that pays the price, but America itself? I've spent my life studying war. And I can tell you the greatest victories aren't won on the battlefield. They're won in the minds of statesmen who know when to fight and when to stop. We're long past the time for fighting. Now, it's time to stop. Before it's too late. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about public opinion shifting, it's about the tectonic plates of American politics grinding against each other in ways we haven't seen since Vietnam. And just like then, the establishment is refusing to read the writing on the wall. They're still operating under the assumption that if they just repeat the same talking points, democracy under siege, Putin the new Hitler, Ukraine must win, the American people will eventually fall in line. But that's not how this works. Not anymore. Let me explain why this matters. In 1968, after years of body bags and broken promises, the American people finally turned on the Vietnam War. Lyndon Johnson, a sitting president with a landslide victory just 4 years earlier, was forced to abandon his re-election bid because his own party couldn't stomach the war anymore. The establishment back then, just like today, tried to dismiss the opposition as isolationist, unpatriotic, even treasonous. But the numbers didn't lie. By 1971, Gallup found that 60% of Americans believed the war was a mistake. Sound familiar? Because we're seeing the exact same dynamic play out now, just with different names in different battlefields. Here's the uncomfortable: the political class in Washington is living in a bubble, and that bubble is about to burst. Take the recent vote on Ukraine aid in the House. The White House and the leadership of both parties expected it to pass easily. After all, they'd been telling us for 2 years that this was a moral imperative, that cutting off aid would be a gift to Putin, that America's credibility was on the line. But when the vote came, 112 Republicans, more than half the GOP conference, voted against it. And that wasn't some fluke. That was the culmination of months of growing frustration, not just among the base, but among rank-and-file members who've been hearing from their constituents. People are done with blank checks. They're done with being told that their tax dollars have to go to a war with no clear endgame while their own communities crumble. And it's not just Republicans. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party is starting to break ranks too. Figures like Ro Khanna and Pramila Jayapal have been vocal about the need for negotiations, not endless escalation. Even Bernie Sanders, who's been a reliable vote for Ukraine aid in the past, has started asking hard questions about where this is all headed. The left's opposition isn't about being soft on Russia, it's about being hard on the idea that America can afford to police the world while its own infrastructure rots. And that's a message that resonates far beyond the usual anti-war crowd. Now, the establishment's response to all this has been double down. The same think tanks that brought us Iraq and Afghanistan are now warning that any retreat on Ukraine would embolden China, undermine NATO, and signal weakness to the world. They trot out retired generals and former officials to warn of a new Munich moment if we don't stand firm. But here's the thing: they've been making those same arguments for 2 years, and the situation on the ground hasn't changed. Ukraine is still losing territory. Russia is still grinding forward. And the American people are still footing the bill. What's really happening here is a fundamental disconnect between the foreign policy blob and the reality of American politics. The blob, those Beltway insiders, defense contractors, and media pundits, still operates under the assumption that the American people will always support whatever war they deem necessary, as long as they frame it the right way. But that assumption is crumbling. The post-9/11 consensus is dead, and no amount of fear-mongering about Putin or Xi is going to bring it back. Let's talk about the 2024 election, because that's where this all comes to a head. Donald Trump, for all his flaws, understands this shift better than anyone in Washington. He's been hammering the message that America can't afford to be the world's policeman, and it's resonating. His base isn't just anti-establishment, it's anti-interventionist in a way we haven't seen since Pat Buchanan's campaigns in the 1990s. And while the media loves to portray Trump as some kind of Russian puppet, the reality is that his opposition to Ukraine aid is far more about domestic politics than any allegiance to Moscow. He's reading the room, and the room is telling him that Americans are tired of endless wars. But here's where it gets interesting. The Democrats, for all their talk about defending democracy, are in a bind. They've tied themselves so closely to the Ukraine narrative that any retreat would be seen as a betrayal of their own base. But if they keep pushing for more aid, they risk alienating the working-class voters they need to win in November. You already see this tension playing out in swing states like Pennsylvania and Michigan, where union workers, traditionally Democratic voters, are asking why their tax dollars are going to Ukraine instead of fixing roads and lowering healthcare costs. The Biden administration's response? More of the same. More weapons. More money. More empty rhetoric about standing with Ukraine until victory. But victory isn't coming. And the American people know it. So what happens next? Here's my projection. The aid package that eventually passes, if it passes at all, will be a shadow of what the White House originally demanded. It'll come with strings attached, maybe even a push for negotiations. And that's when the real reckoning begins. Because once the money starts drying up, Ukraine's position becomes untenable. The Russians know this. The Europeans know this. And the Ukrainians know it too. That's why Zelensky has been so desperate to lock in long-term commitments from the West. But the West isn't committing. Because the West is running out of money, and more importantly, it's running out of political will. Now, let's talk about the domestic fallout. If the war drags on without a clear path to victory, we're going to see a backlash unlike anything we've experienced in decades. The anti-war movement, which has been relatively quiet since the Iraq War, is starting to stir. You see it in the protests outside the White House, in the op-eds from former officials calling for negotiations, in the growing number of veterans groups speaking out against the war. And this isn't just a left-wing phenomenon. There's a quiet but growing disillusionment on the right too, among those who once supported the war but now see it as another endless conflict with no clear American interest. The establishment's response to this will be to try to silence the opposition. They'll call it isolationism. They'll call it appeasement. They'll trot out the usual suspects to warn of the dangers of retreat. But it won't work. Because the American people aren't stupid. They see the cost. They see the lack of progress. And they're done being told that they have to choose between supporting Ukraine and fixing their own country. Here's the bottom: the political class in Washington is about to face a reckoning. The era of endless wars is over, and the sooner they accept that, the better. Because if they don't, the backlash isn't just going to be political, it's going to be generational. We're already seeing the first signs of it in the rise of figures like J.D. Vance and Tulsi Gabbard, who are tapping into this anti-interventionist sentiment. And if the establishment keeps ignoring it, they're going to wake up one day and find that the American people have moved on without them. The question is, will they listen before it's too late? Or will they keep doubling down until the bill comes due and it's not just Ukraine that pays the price, but the credibility of the entire American foreign policy establishment? I've seen this movie before. And I can tell you how it ends. The only question is whether our leaders will have the wisdom to change the script before it's too late. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine, it's about the fundamental mismatch between America's strategic ambitions and its actual capacity to shape the world. The establishment keeps acting as if we're still in the unipolar moment of the 1990s, when the US could dictate terms to anyone, anywhere, with minimal consequences. But that world is gone. Russia isn't Iraq. It isn't Libya. It's a nuclear-armed great power with a population of 140 million, a GDP larger than Italy's, and a military that, despite its early stumbles, has adapted to the realities of modern warfare in ways NATO still hasn't. And yet, our policy remains stuck in the same old arm the underdog, escalate incrementally, and hope the other side blinks first. It's not just naive, it's strategically illiterate. Let me explain why this matters. The Biden administration's approach to Ukraine has been defined by two fatal flaws. First, they've treated this as a moral crusade rather than a geopolitical contest. Don't get me wrong, Putin's invasion was illegal, brutal, and indefensible. But wars aren't won on moral outrage alone. They're won by aligning ends with means, and right now, our ends are maximalist regime change in Moscow, total Ukrainian victory, the humiliation of Russia, while our means are self-limiting. We're supplying just enough weapons to keep Ukraine in the fight but not enough to win, while simultaneously tying their hands with restrictions on how they can use them. It's the worst of both. We're prolonging the war without giving Ukraine a path to victory, and we're doing it at a cost of over $100 billion a year, money that could be spent rebuilding our own decaying infrastructure or countering China's rise in the Pacific. Second, the administration has failed to articulate a coherent theory of victory. What does success look like? Is it pushing Russia back to the 2014 lines? The 1991 borders? The overthrow of Putin? No one in Washington seems to know, because no one wants to admit that some of these outcomes are simply not achievable without a direct NATO-Russia war. And yet, we keep hearing the same tired talking: we must stand with Ukraine as long as it takes. As long as what takes? As long as the money holds out? As long as the American public stays on board? As long as Russia doesn't escalate to tactical nukes? These aren't strategies, they're slogans. And in war, slogans get people killed. Here's the uncomfortable: the only way this war ends is through negotiation. Not because negotiation is morally superior, but because it's the only outcome that both sides can accept without resorting to catastrophic escalation. The question is, what kind of negotiation? The establishment's fear is that any talk of compromise will be seen as surrender, that it will embolden Putin and signal weakness to Beijing. But the alternative, continuing to pour resources into a stalemate while Russia grinds down Ukrainian forces and the American public grows increasingly restive, is far worse. The longer this drags on, the weaker our position becomes. Ukraine is losing soldiers at a rate of 1,000 a day, according to some estimates. Their manpower is finite. Their economy is in shambles. And every day that passes, Russia consolidates its hold on the territories it seized, making them harder to dislodge. Now, I'm not suggesting we force Ukraine to the table tomorrow. But we need to start preparing the ground for a diplomatic off-ramp, and that means being honest about the realities on the battlefield. The first step is to stop pretending that a Ukrainian victory is just around the corner. It's not. The second is to recognize that Russia's red lines, no NATO action, no Ukrainian membership in the alliance, and no return of Crimea, are non-negotiable for Moscow. That doesn't mean we have to accept them, but it does mean we have to account for them in our planning. The third is to start thinking about what a post-war European security architecture looks like. Because one way or another, this war is going to end, and when it does, we're going to need a framework that prevents it from happening again. The alternative is what we're seeing as slow-motion disaster. A war of attrition that bleeds Ukraine dry, drains American resources, and leaves Europe more divided than ever. A war that, if it continues on its current trajectory, could very well end with a Russian victory by default, not because Putin is stronger, but because the West lacks the will to sustain the fight. And that's the real danger here. Because if Russia wins in Ukraine, it won't just be a defeat for Kiev. It will be a defeat for the entire post-Cold War order. It will signal to revisionist powers like China that the US is a paper tiger, that our alliances are hollow, and that our resolve is limited. And that's a lesson that will be paid for in blood, not just in Ukraine, but in Taiwan, the South China Sea, and beyond. So where does that leave us? It leaves us at a crossroads. One path leads to a negotiated settlement, imperfect but sustainable, that preserves Ukraine's sovereignty while acknowledging the limits of American power. The other leads to a protracted conflict that weakens the West, strengthens our adversaries, and leaves Ukraine as a failed state on Europe's doorstep. The establishment will tell you that the first path is surrender. But I've seen surrender before. Surrender is what happens when you bet everything on a losing hand and refuse to fold. Surrender is what happens when you double down on a bad strategy until there's nothing left to lose. The real courage, the real leadership, is in recognizing when the game is no longer winnable and having the wisdom to change the rules before it's too late. I've spent my life studying war, and I can tell you every conflict ends the same way. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Not with a decisive victory, but with a weary compromise. The only question is how much blood and treasure we're willing to spend before we accept that reality. The American people are already ahead of their leaders on this. They see the cost. They feel the strain. And they're no longer willing to write blank checks for a war with no end in sight. The question is, will Washington listen before it's too late? Or will they keep chasing the illusion of total victory until the bill comes due, and it's not just Ukraine that pays the price, but the very idea of American leadership in the 21st century? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And right now, the rhyme is getting louder. The last time America found itself in a quagmire with no clear exit strategy, it took us a decade to extract ourselves, and the damage to our credibility lasted far longer. This time, the stakes are even higher. Because this isn't just about one war. It's about whether America still has the wisdom to lead, or whether we've become so addicted to the idea of our own indispensability that we've forgotten how to be strategic. The clock is ticking. And the longer we wait, the harder it will be to walk away with our dignity intact.